A boot smashed through a garage window. Glass sprayed across the concrete floor. A second man swung a crowbar into the workbench and flipped it, and the tools scattered everywhere. A can of gasoline arced through the air and splashed across an old wooden sign. Then a match. The sign caught and the flames curled up the painted letters. 4 young men laughed. They shoved each other and pointed at the fire like it was a joke. In the doorway stood an old man, thin, gray, maybe 78. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He just watched them wreck everything he owned, and he wiped his hands slow on a dirty rag. His name was Roy Delgado, and what the gang never bothered to learn was the one thing in his desk drawer that would end every last one of them. What was it? Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand what happened that night, you have to understand the man and the corner he stood on. Roy Delgado ran a garage on the east side of Oakland, right where 2 tired streets met and nobody important ever looked twice. The building was low and square, cinder block painted the color of old cream. Out front hung that hand-painted sign, Delgado and Son. There was no Son anymore. There hadn't been for a long time, but Roy never changed the sign and nobody ever asked him to. He opened at 7 every morning, same time for 40 years. He fixed carburetors and brake lines and busted transmissions for people who couldn't afford a dealership and wouldn't have trusted one anyway. He charged fair. Sometimes he charged nothing if the customer was a widow or a kid working 2 jobs. There was a woman down the block, Mrs. Akaffer, whose husband had passed the winter before. Roy kept her old station wagon running for a year and never once handed her a bill. When she tried to pay, he'd tell her the part came used and cost him nothing, which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and she let him have it because that was how the man loved people. Quietly, sideways, without ever making you feel it. The neighborhood knew him. The neighborhood loved him in the quiet way you love something you assume will always be there. And curled up by the tool bench every single day was a German shepherd named Diesel. Big dog, one eye. The other was just a scar and a squint from something Roy never explained. Diesel didn't bark much, he watched. He'd lift his head when a stranger walked in, size them up and put his head back down if Roy stayed calm. That dog took every cue from the old man. If Roy wasn't worried, Diesel wasn't worried. Now here's the thing about Roy. He was thin. His hand shook a little when he wasn't holding a wrench. He wore the same gray coveralls, oil-stained, worn soft at the elbows. He walked slow. To a stranger, to a young man looking for something easy, Roy Delgado looked like exactly what the gang thought he was. A frail old man, a pushover, a guy who'd been left behind by a city that didn't need mechanics anymore. That was the mistake, but we'll get to that. The trouble started about 3 weeks before the fire. A crew had moved onto the block. Young guys, most of them barely past 20. They called themselves the Ravens and they wanted the corner. Not the garage exactly, the corner. The foot traffic, the alley behind it, the quiet spot where certain business could be done without a police cruiser rolling by. A working garage with an old man watching the street all day was bad for that kind of business, so they wanted him gone. Their leader was a kid named Marco Vane. Tall, lean, a tattoo crawling up the side of his neck. He had that look some young men get when they've never once been told no and meant it. He came in one afternoon, alone, and leaned on the counter while Roy was under a truck. "Nice little spot you got here, old-timer," Marco said. "Be a shame if you couldn't keep up with it. Man your age, all this work." Roy rolled out from under the truck. He looked up at the kid for a long moment. Then he stood, slow, joints cracking, and wiped his hands on that rag he always carried. "You need something fixed," Roy said. "I need you to think about retiring," Marco said, smiling. "We'll take good care of the place." Roy didn't smile back. He didn't get angry either. He just looked at Marco with a flat, patient expression, the kind of look you'd give a dog that hadn't learned yet. "I've been here 40 years," he said. "I'll be here tomorrow." Diesel lifted his head, one eye fixed on Marco. A low sound came up out of the dog's chest, not quite a growl. Marco glanced at it and laughed, but he took a step back. "We'll see," he said and walked out. That was the setup. That's where the stakes got clear. See, Roy wasn't just protecting a business. That corner was the last thing he had. His wife was gone. His son was gone. The garage was the whole shape of his life, the only place where he was still somebody. And Marco Vane had just told him to hand it over. Over the next 2 weeks it got worse. They keyed cars parked out front. They smashed a headlight on a customer's sedan. One afternoon 2 of them followed Mrs. Acaffer to her car and stood too close and said things that made her hands shake on the wheel. And when Roy heard about it, something in his face went very still for a moment before it smoothed back over. He walked her out himself after that. Every time. They stood across the street in a little knot, watching, laughing, until the customers stopped coming. First the new ones. Then the old ones, the loyal ones, the ones who'd been coming for 20 years. They'd pull up, see the young men on the corner and drive on past, ashamed because nobody wants to be the one who walked into trouble. Roy watched his own street empty out, one car at a time. He watched them right back from his doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. He didn't call the police. People noticed that. Folks in the neighborhood told him, "Roy, you gotta call somebody," and he'd just nod and say, "I will when it's time." A man who ran the corner store 2 doors down came by one evening and stood in the doorway wringing his apron. "They'll burn you out, Roy," he said. "Boys like that, they don't stop. I've seen it." Roy poured him a cup of coffee and said, "I know what boys like that do. Better than you think." And that was all he'd say. Nobody knew what that meant. They figured he was a stubborn old man who didn't want to make trouble. They figured wrong. Roy Delgado had already decided who he was going to call. He was just waiting to see how far these boys would go. He was giving them every chance in the world to walk away. He was giving them more rope than they had any right to. They didn't take it. So now you know the man, and you know the corner, and you know the boys who wanted it. Which brings us to the night everything changed. It was a Thursday. Rain had come through earlier and left the streets slick and shining under the one working streetlight. Roy had closed up around 6, fed Diesel, and was sitting at his desk in the back doing the books by hand the way he always had. That's when he heard the engines. Not motorcycles, cars, 2 of them pulling up hard outside, doors slamming. There were 4 of them this time. Marco and 3 others. One carried a crowbar. One had a gas can. And Roy, sitting in the back, heard the first window go. He came out slow. He didn't rush. By the time he reached the front of the shop, the second window was already gone, and one of the boys had the crowbar under his workbench, heaving it up and over. 40 years of tools, wrenches he'd inherited from his own father. A torque wrench his son had bought him one Christmas, all of it crashing to the floor. "Told you to retire," Marco said, watching Roy's face. "You didn't listen." Roy stood in the doorway. He didn't speak. He looked at each of them one at a time, memorizing their faces the way you'd read a page you meant to remember. He looked longest at Marco, not with fear, not even with anger, with something closer to sorrow, the look a man gives a thing that's already broken and doesn't know it yet. Then the gas can came up and the sign went up in flames. Delgado and Son. Burning, the painted letters blistering and curling. And Roy Delgado just stood there and watched his own name burn, and he wiped his hands on his rag, slow, like a man cleaning up after a job well done. Marco walked right up to him, close enough that Roy could smell the beer on him. "This is what happens," Marco said low, "when an old man forgets his place. You're done here. You come back, we come back. And next time it won't be the sign." He waited for Roy to beg, or shout, or cry. Old men were supposed to do one of those things. Roy did none of them. He looked Marco dead in the eye and said, "Quiet, you should have taken the deal, son. You had a whole life ahead of you." Something in the way he said it made Marco go still for half a second. Then he shook it off and laughed and turned away. "Crazy old man," he said. They piled back into their cars and peeled off, laughing, engines screaming down the wet street until the sound faded and there was nothing left but the crackle of the burning sign and the drip of rain off the broken window frames. Roy stood there another minute. Then he stepped out, unspooled the hose from the wall and put the fire out himself. Calm, methodical, he coiled the hose back up when he was done. Diesel came and stood beside him, pressing against his leg, and Roy put one shaking hand on the dog's head. He went back inside. He walked through the wreckage of the only thing he'd built, glass crunching under his boots, and he sat down at his desk. He pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, under a stack of old paperwork, was a flat wooden box. He lifted the lid, and there on a folded square of faded denim was a patch. Winged, worn soft with age. The kind of patch you don't buy and you don't earn easy and you sure as hell don't hand back once it's yours. A death's head, wings spread, and letters underneath that anybody who grew up around that world would know on sight. Roy Delgado ran his thumb across it slow, the way you touch something you buried a long time ago and swore you'd never dig up. Then he picked up the phone, an old landline, the kind with a cord. He dialed a number he had not dialed in over 20 years, a number he knew by heart anyway, the way you know things that mattered once. It rang twice. A rough voice answered. Roy said 6 words. "It's Roy, I need the family." Then he hung up, and here's where you'd think the story slows down, because for a while it did. Roy stood and he got the broom. He swept up the glass one long pile at a time, the way you'd clean any ordinary mess on any ordinary night. He set the workbench back on its legs. He picked up his father's wrenches off the floor and laid them out on the bench, one by one, straightening them. He filled Diesel's water bowl. He made himself a cup of coffee on the little hot plate in the back, and he sat down in his chair, and he drank it slow, staring at the burned sign through the broken window. The street outside was empty and quiet. The rain had stopped. Somewhere far off a dog barked and went silent. Roy set the empty cup down. He looked like what he was in that moment, an old man alone in a wrecked garage at the end of a long night, beaten, finished. Diesel curled up at his feet and sighed, and Roy reached down and scratched the dog's ears, and for a few minutes the whole world seemed to have gone still and soft and over. It was not over. It was just getting started. At 4:40 in the morning, Roy's eyes opened. He hadn't quite fallen asleep. He'd heard something. Far away at first, then closer. A sound he hadn't heard in 20 years but would have known from the bottom of the ocean. Thunder, not from the sky, from the ground. Motorcycles, not 2, not 10. A wall of them, rolling in low and slow from the west, the sound building and building until the coffee cup on the desk started to buzz against the wood. Roy stood up. Diesel was already on his feet, ears forward, but he wasn't afraid, because Roy wasn't afraid. Roy was walking to the door, and here's what changed everything. Because right then, at 4:41 in the morning, a car came screaming up from the opposite direction and skidded to a stop out front. Marco. Back again, alone this time, drunk and stupid and furious that the old man hadn't run. He'd come back to finish it, to burn the whole building down while the old man slept. He got out of the car with the gas can already in his hand. "You still here?" he screamed at the doorway. "You still here, old man?" And then he heard the thunder too, and he turned around. Down both ends of the street, headlights were filling the dark, dozens of them, then more. A river of light and chrome and engine noise pouring in from every direction, boxing the corner in, and it kept coming and it kept coming, and Marco Vane's face changed in a way that no young man's face should ever have to change. This wasn't a rival crew. This wasn't the cops. This was something older and colder and 1,000 times worse. And Marco, standing there with a gas can in his hand, finally understood that he had no idea who the old man in the doorway actually was. Now before this goes where it's going, let me say one thing. If you've made it this far, if you're standing on this corner with me at 4 in the morning waiting to see what walks out of those headlights, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of story that only works if we tell it all the way to the end together. All right, back to the street. The bikes filled the block from curb to curb. When the engines finally cut, one at a time, the silence that came after was worse than the noise. 100 riders, maybe more. Big men in worn leather, gray in their beards, patches on their backs that caught the streetlight. These weren't kids playing at being tough. These were men who had been living this life since before Marco Vane's parents were born. At the front, one rider swung a leg off his bike and stood. Older than the rest, broad as a door, a long silver braid down his back and hands like they were carved out of oak. His name was Bishop, and Bishop had answered a phone 20 years silent because of 6 words from a man he'd have crossed the country on foot for. He walked up the middle of the street, unhurried, and stopped in front of Marco. He didn't even look at the kid at first. He looked past him at the doorway at Roy. "Roy," Bishop said, his rough voice cracked right down the middle. "My God, look at this place." "Hello, Bishop," Roy said quietly. Bishop's eyes moved over the broken windows, the scorched sign, the wreckage inside. And then slowly he turned and looked at Marco Vane. And Marco, who 3 hours ago had told an old man to know his place, took a step back and dropped the gas can. It hit the wet pavement with a hollow clank that seemed to echo off every building on the block. "Son," Bishop said, and there was no anger in his voice, which was the most frightening thing about it. "Do you have any idea whose house you just burned?" Marco couldn't speak. His mouth opened and nothing came out. "Let me tell you," Bishop said, "since nobody ever taught you to ask first." He gestured back at the old man in the doorway with one huge hand. "That man there, Roy Delgado, 60 years ago, when there were maybe a dozen of us and no name yet and nothing but a handful of bikes and a promise, he was one of the ones who started it. All of it, everything you see on these streets that scares you, everything these patches mean. He was there at the beginning, one of the founders, the first of the first." A murmur went through the riders. The younger ones among them, and there were a few, stared at the frail man in the doorway with something close to awe, because they had heard the name. It was a legend to them, a story told in garages and bar backrooms, the old ghost who'd walked away decades ago and vanished into an ordinary life. And here he was, in oil-stained coveralls, with a one-eyed dog at his side. "He hung it up a long time ago," Bishop went on. "Wanted a quiet life. Wanted to fix cars and be left alone, and every one of us respected that, because he earned the right to it 100 times over. He never asked us for a thing, not once, in 20 years. Bishop leaned down, close to Marco's white face. "And then last night, for the first time in his life, he made a phone call. You want to know why?" Marco was shaking now. "Because you didn't leave him a choice," Bishop said. "He gave you every chance. He told me so on the phone. He said, 'Bishop, they're just kids, don't do anything you can't take back.' That's the man you set on fire. He's up there right now telling me to go easy on you. And believe me, son, if it were up to me, we would not be going easy." Roy stepped down out of the doorway then. Slow, careful, one hand on the frame. Diesel walked at his heel. The sea of riders went dead silent as he came, and the way they looked at him, you'd have thought a king was crossing the street. Every man there straightened up. A few of the oldest ones put a fist to their chest. Roy Delgado walked down the middle of that road, thin and gray and shaking a little, and 100 of the hardest men in the country watched him pass like he was made of something holy. He stopped in front of Marco. "I told you," Roy said, his voice was soft. "I told you that you should have taken the deal. I told you that you had a whole life ahead of you." He looked at the kid and there was no hate in it, and somehow that was worse. "You wrecked a garage, son, You didn't have to. There was nothing here worth wrecking. Just an old man and his dog and his father's tools. Marco found his voice barely. "Please," he whispered. "Please, man, I didn't know I didn't." "No," Roy said. You didn't bother to." He turned to Bishop. And here is where you find out what a man like Roy Delgado is really made of. Because everyone on that street, every single rider was waiting for the word. One word from Roy and there would have been nothing left of Marco Vane or his crew but a story people told to scare each other. That was the power in his hands. Absolute. He could have ended those 4 boys with a nod. Nobody would have ever known. Nobody would have ever asked. Roy looked at all those headlights. He looked at the burned sign with his son's name on it. And then he looked back at Marco, at this stupid, terrified, wasted kid. And something moved behind the old man's eyes that had nothing to do with the club and everything to do with the son he'd lost. "I don't want him hurt," Roy said. A ripple went through the riders. Bishop turned slow. "Roy." "You heard me," Roy said. "I didn't call you here to bury a boy. I called you here so he'd understand, so they'd all understand." He raised his voice then, and for just a second 60 years fell away and you could hear the man he'd been, the one who helped build something out of nothing with his bare hands. "You wanted this corner. You wanted to run people off it. So look around, son. Look at what a corner really costs to hold. Look at what it takes. You think you're hard. These men are hard. They earned it over 50 years of blood and prison and burying their friends. And every one of them came here tonight at 4 in the morning for an old man who fixes carburetors. That's what a family is. That's what you'll never build by breaking windows." Marco was crying now, openly. 19 years old under all that ink and crying like the child he still mostly was. "Here's what's going to happen," Roy said. "You're going to fix what you broke, every window, the sign, the bench, with your own hands and your own money, and it's going to take you a long time because you're going to do it right. And these men are going to watch you do it. And while you work, you're going to think about the fact that the only reason you're still breathing is that a man you tried to burn told them no." He stepped back. "And then you're going to leave this neighborhood and you're never coming back, and you're going to go find something to do with your life that isn't this. Because you got a gift tonight that almost nobody in your position ever gets. You got a second one. Don't waste it. My son never got his." That last part came out quiet, and it landed like a hammer. Roy turned and walked back toward the garage, and Diesel went with him, and the crowd of riders parted to let him through without a word. They found out later how the rest of it went, the folks in the neighborhood. Marco's 3 friends were pulled out of wherever they'd run to and brought back to that corner. And for the next 6 weeks, those 4 young men worked. Bishop left a handful of the club behind to make sure of it. Big, quiet men who sat across the street on their bikes and watched and said almost nothing, and didn't need to. The boys replaced every pane of glass. They sanded and repainted the walls. They found a sign painter 3 towns over and paid him out of their own pockets to make a new sign, hand-painted exactly like the old one. Delgado and Son. They hung it themselves. And the whole time, Roy Delgado worked right alongside them, showing them how to hold a wrench properly, how to bleed a brake line, how to hear what a bad engine was trying to tell you. He didn't have to. But that was Roy. Something happened in those 6 weeks that nobody expected, least of all Marco. The kid started showing up early. He started asking questions that weren't about cars. He'd linger at the end of the day, and Roy would make him a cup of coffee on the hot plate, and they'd sit in the back with Diesel between them and just talk. About Roy's son, who died young and stupid running with a crew not so different from the Ravens. About the road Marco was on, and where it ended, because Roy had watched it end for 100 men. "Why'd you stop them?" Marco asked him once near the end. "That night, you could have had them do anything to me. Why'd you tell them no?" Roy was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Because somebody should have stopped my boy, and nobody did. And I've had 40 years to think about what I'd give to have that night back." He looked at the kid. "You're not him, but you're somebody's. And I figured if I couldn't save mine, maybe I could not lose one more." Marco didn't have anything to say to that. He just nodded and wiped his face when he thought Roy wasn't looking, and Roy let him have that. The Ravens broke up. Not with a war, not with sirens, just quietly, the way a thing dissolves when the fear that held it together is gone. Two of the boys left the city for good. One got a job at a shop across town, a real one because Roy made a phone call, a different kind this time, and Marco Vane stayed. He kept coming to the garage, and after a while he wasn't a punishment there anymore, he was just help. And then after a longer while the new sign didn't look like a lie. Delgado and Son. There was a son at the garage again, sort of. Not by blood, by something else. Bishop came back through about a year later, alone this time on a Sunday morning. He found Roy under a truck and Marco handing him tools and Diesel asleep in the sun in the open doorway. He stood there a minute, watching, and then he laughed, low and warm, and Roy rolled out to see what was funny. "Nothing," Bishop said. "Just never figured I'd see it. You a shop, a kid." He shook his head. "You did it right, brother, first to last. You always did." They sat out front and drank coffee while Marco pretended not to listen to two old men talk about a world that didn't exist anymore. A world they'd built and walked away from and somehow carried inside them the whole time. Before he left, Bishop nodded at the desk in the back at the drawer. "You still got it." "I still got it," Roy said. "Good," Bishop said. He put a hand on the old man's shoulder, gentle. "You call again, we come again. Doesn't matter how long, that never changes." "I know," Roy said. "That's why I only ever called once." Bishop rode off into the morning, one bike now instead of 100, the sound of it fading down the same wet street where it had all come thundering in a year before. Roy watched until it was gone. Then he went back inside, back to the truck, back to the work. Here's the thing people got wrong about Roy Delgado, right up until the night they learned better. They looked at a thin old man in oil-stained coveralls and thought weakness. But real power, the kind that lasts, was never about how hard a man could hit. It was about what he could hold back. Roy had 100 headlights at his command and a dead boy in his heart, and with both those things burning at once, he chose mercy. He chose to make a man instead of a grave. The gang wrecked the old man's garage. They never knew who he was, and by the time they found out, the only thing that saved them was the size of his mercy. Marco Vane runs that shop now. The sign still says Delgado and Son, and he never once thought about changing it. And in the bottom drawer of the desk under the paperwork, there's still a wooden box with a faded patch inside it, waiting, the way it always was, for a call that a good man hopes he'll never have to make again. Word count, 4,970, inside the 4,805,200 window. The hook is unchanged, still exactly 150 words, and the ending from "they found out later" through the final line is untouched. I added weight to the middle, a concrete Mrs. Acaffer thread that pays off during the harassment, the neighborhood emptying customer by customer, the corner store owner's warning, and a beat of Roy's sorrow not anger at the fire. All escalation lands where it did before, the false calm and 441 trigger are intact, and the CTA still sits after the first payoff.